Hey y'all, Moses here. In this video I want to cover one of the most asked questions I receive in the comments, on stream, and in general, and that is how to spot enemies effectively in PLAYERUNKNOWNS Battlegrounds. There are three primary components to spotting enemies in PUBG, and those are audio, visual, and intuitive/game sense cues. I will do my best to cover the various ways that you can use these cues to predict and spot enemy movement, but like my other videos, this topic is subjective to your skill, hardware setup, and game settings. One thing to note, in many situations you cannot look everywhere at once and you will be surprised by enemies you simply don't see. The one thing to focus on with this topic is the control of your immediate surroundings by utilizing patience, intuition, and effective decision making. So with that said, let's get started. The first thing I'd like to cover is audio cues. One thing to note from a hardware perspective is that PUBG's sound model is still very much under development. Currently, the best audio setup is a stereo audio setup. Disable your headphones' surround features and make sure your surround speakers are set to stereo. Audio models drastically differ depending on if you are outside or inside. Typically, you will receive more accurate information when outdoors due to the restrictive nature of the audio model inside of buildings. For example, it is easier to determine where a player is inside a building from the exterior than the interior. Gunshots can be muffled by terrain and will sound obviously more distant regardless of whether the shooter is on the other side of a large hill or just around a ridge in front of you. When approaching what sounds like distant gunfire, be ready to be in view of an enemy that is potentially closer than they sound. Bullets that crack suggest accurate fire and you are in immediate danger. At this point, if you are standing still, it's time to move and pan your camera quickly to look for the source of the shot. If you heard the crack before you heard the gunshot, that suggests that the player is beyond medium range, potentially sniping at a distance. Similarly, bullet whizzes suggest that bullets are flying close to you but are not nearly as close as cracks. Bullets will crack when they are as close as 5 meters to you and will whiz beyond 5 meters and up to 15 meters. So, cracks and whizzes again suggest that you are under fire and it's time to move. If you're receiving gunfire, try to look at the edges of trees, buildings, and other covered positions to determine the source of the gunfire in a predictable fashion. Players will often prefer to shoot from cover rather than in the open unless it's a dire situation. So when evading gunfire, look for covered positions and keep moving to make sure that you don't get taken out. As the game progresses, audio information such as gunshots, vehicles, and airplane noises from crate drops become increasingly important. In late game circles, gunfire matched with the kill feed can give you an understanding of who is equipped with what and where they are generally located. This will inform your movement and visual orientation headed into the endgame. The second component I'd like to cover is visual cues. The most obvious visual cue when it comes to spotting enemies is the enemy themselves. This point is obviously simple, but in reality taking the time to sit and actually inspect what an enemy player is doing can also inform you of additional enemies or other important information. If you immediately spot a player, look at where they are aiming, firing, or moving to more easily anticipate your next move. Don't be too quick to engage as you may end up revealing your position to other enemies you might not have seen. When landing near or entering a city, especially in the early game, use open doors to track the path of potential enemies. If you notice a pattern of open doors terminating suddenly, you may be very close to an enemy player. Many players tend to take cover on second floors or on roofs of buildings. If playing in third person, it is important to recognize angles in which you can be observed with a third person camera. In first person, you are slightly safer and should direct your attention to rooftops and second story windows when you think a player is nearby. This can be stated for many stages of the game, as elevated positions in second stories are great vantage points but are easily predictable spots for players looking for an easy kill. When it comes to locating enemy fire, the first thing you need to try to spot are muzzle flashes. If you cannot easily spot the muzzle flash, there are a few things I can give you or a few tips that you can use to determine the origination of the shots. 1. If the bullet impacts in front of you or hits you behind flat cover, you should immediately assume that the player is behind you. This should narrow your attention to 180 degrees. Hopefully the sound of the gunshot in addition to the visual cues should be enough to inform you of a more precise location of the shooter. If you are struck by the bullet, again, you are in immediate danger. This may seem obvious, but going prone and assuming you are safe is the easiest way for your round to end. If you are struck, begin to move and determine where the location of the shooter might be. Even if you fail, standing still is infinitely more futile than evading and trying to return fire. With this in mind, get in the habit of constantly moving to avoid being randomly headshot. This could mean rocking back and forth or constantly crouching and standing. In most cases, trying to stay calm is the best way to spot an enemy who is shooting at you. Assume you are about to be shot at any time and it will be less of a surprise when it actually happens. The third point is arguably the most important, but also the hardest to describe. Game sense and intuition cues come in multiple forms and are generally only easy to spot or anticipate with experience. To help give you a basic understanding of game sense, I'm going to leverage this visual aid and simulate a round using the blue circles to show the progression of the play zone, red circles to show you population areas, and lines to show potential enemy player migration paths. Again, this is entirely simulated and may be overly simple, but I hope the concepts make sense. Okay, so for the last part of this video, I'm going to use this kind of visual aid. Now, right out of the gate, I know this might look a little visually disturbing. I'm going to do my best, or a little visually confusing even. I'm going to do my best to try and explain everything here. So right out of the gate, we have this, this diagonal line here through the middle of the map, denoting the plane path and the relative distance that you could potentially jump. And then within that, you have red circles for dense loot areas or city places where people would have jumped on this plane path. You know, Primorsk and Severny aren't necessarily too far away from the plane path. Maybe Severny should have a red circle on it, but whatever. This is the most likely of jump spots. You know, maybe plus the prison and some other stuff. Anyway, it's an example. Let's jump right in. So the lines, just as an FYI, are just initial and then continuing player paths or potential paths. Now, this example is not going to cover all potential examples, and even my play zones shrinking in the form of blue and then finally a white circle here might not be accurate or even to scale. But the concept is here. The concept here is actually anticipation and kind of intuition around player movement, and using that to kind of guide where you're looking for enemies and, you know, and attempting to spot enemies in certain areas. So let's start from the beginning. Okay, so you have your initial plane path, and this dark blue circle here is your initial circle. So right out of the gate, Georgia Pole is coming out of the play zone, as well as Severny, Zarki, Primorsk, and mostly Mill to Power as well. So these yellow lines kind of show where most players kind of go to get into the zone. Maybe if you're North George, you kind of come along, you want to go down to Razak or maybe even down this way. But for the most part, you're coming around the Georgia Pole Mountain and into Gatka and into the fields here, or in around the side of the mountain past the ruins to Razak or this area here. So if you have landed in this area or landed at Georgia Pole, you're going to assume that there are going to be players in these areas, just judging by the path of least resistance to the play zone, which would be choke points here and here. So if you're coming around this side, you want to be aware of players in Gatka around the base of the mountain and along these roads. Similarly with Severny, if you're up here, Severny in this particular example would probably be, you know, you've probably fought your way out of Severny, so you're most likely relatively lonely coming into the play zone up here. But in here is a different story, because you have multiple areas where players are still able to stay and loot without having to move very far. Specifically Razak, the school and apartments, Pachinki, Polyana, Novo, and the military base, all extremely popular loot zones. So there will be fighting and some fall off. So this first circle is still going to have upwards of 55 to 65 players still in it. Now, the second circle coming in is where things start to get a little different. So the green lines here show player paths coming into the second circle. I know that some kind of go into the third circle, but let's just assume for this example that players will have to leave Yasnaya, Polyana, the military base, and Novo. So the military base, people will be taking boats in the bridge here, and Novo, the bridge. So essentially you're going to have hot spots down here. So again, if you are coming from the military base or for Novo, you're fighting your way out for boats or cars or even getting across the bridge. So there will be a lot of deaths here as well. This spotting aspect doesn't become particularly important until the third circle and the beginning of the third circle. So let's say you're a lucky guy and you jumped into Milta, you fought around, or you're down here kind of hanging out. And now the third circle is beginning. You have to recognize that there's going to be an absolute ton of traffic coming from high density loot zones like Razak and Pachinki. In this particular case, it's denoted by these kind of magenta lines. So Razak and Pachinki, these two towns typically filter to the same spot. Now you'll come out of the apartments up the hill, and Pachinki will, again up this part of the hill to the top part of Murdered Hill or Pachinki Hill, whatever you want to call it. There's going to be an intense amount of fighting in these areas, and now you're entering into the mid game. So the mid game between, let's say, 35 and 45 or even 50 players, let's say, could still be alive, considering how many loot zones are still in. So if you're in this area, the first thing you want to be doing is listening for audio cues and looking for vehicles coming into the loot or into the safe zone from these directions, because players that have waited too long at the edge or come across from the bridge are going to be in vehicles coming this way. So if you're in this area, you're going to have to be extremely wary. Now, even if you're in Milta or even over by prison, you're still going to have to the need for movement out of the prison is kind of a necessity. Just because, prison, even if you get 100% great loot there, you're still going to have to go to a place like warehouse and then kind of move, maybe just looking for fights. I think in this particular example, if you've landed in Milta or the prison, either you've fought your way out of either one of those two and have moved on to another loot zone, or are roaming looking for fights because the play zone is on your side. So for those of those players who don't have that advantage and are having to travel to the safe zone, there's going to be pressure on the outside of the circle. So if you're down in this area, you want to be looking for players coming in from Razak and Pachinki, and even if you're up here, maybe in from Yasnaya. So when it comes to later circles and the entrance to the late game, I think is where a lot of players seem to have problems. So in the top 20 and surviving in the top 20 is all about circle luck and positioning, and that's kind of hard to illustrate. So I'm going to give you some examples. So in this particular circle structure, it's pretty linear. It just kind of shrinks around this center point. But players have fought and are dying in this area. Milta people who are camping are probably okay. Maybe those hanging out around the ridge by prison are okay. So let's say there's 20 players left, and we're at the 4th and then 5th, and then there will be some final circles that I haven't illustrated here. So we're going to be now focusing on this area here. So whoever has fought and lived, again, is coming into the play zone in these directions. So even if you have come up from Milta or the bridge or military base and you're in this area, you're still going to have a lot of fighting coming into the most obvious or the most convenient place in the safe zone. Similarly, from Yasnaya, you're still having a good amount of pressure put on this top third of this entrance to the play zone. So this area is extremely dangerous. So if you're in this area, in this situation, you want to be looking outwards to the circle edges to see how many people are coming in either through vehicle or on foot. Now, even then, if you think that you're safe by taking out players coming into the zone, you're wrong, because, well, you may be right, but there's still a chance that there are going to be a significant amount of activity and players in this area. A little less so on this side until this circle changes. Now, if you're in Milta and you have to come into this new play zone, you have this large area where players are now filtering in. Now, this is kind of a dead spot on the map between prison and Milta. This is all wooded area with these little interspersions of houses, and I think this is the logging camp. Yeah, the logging camp's in there. Not a particularly dense place, but even as you come in here, and this is just the style of the game, you're going to be put in close quarters. So what you want to be doing in this case is engaging in this area, and you'll have houses, and there could be players all over the place, but just using what you know from an information standpoint is that these decent houses on the edge of the loot zone, those are going to have players in them. just on the inside of the new play zone will be a ripe place for players to head to who have camped their way into the end game already. So they're going to be looking for further shelter, and places like here where there's again buildings on the edge of this fifth circle. And then ultimately you'll get into the late game, and after this circle, it's almost all audio and visual information. Game sense and whatnot will come in the form of rocks and trees rather than large loot areas emptying into certain parts of the map. So I hope this kind of makes a little bit more sense from a overview and understanding standpoint, but I hope it works for the format of this video. I wanted to make this guide more in-depth and maybe with a concept that wasn't just, look for muzzle flashes and look for audio, but I hope this part of the guide makes a little bit more sense. If you liked the video, please like it. If you loved it, maybe subscribe and come back and check us out in the future for more content like this. Of course, visit us on Twitch at twitch.tv/wtfmoses. And let me know what you think down in the comments, what you kind of think of this kind of concept, if you'd like to see more of this kind of illustrative guide in the future. So leave me a comment, but if I don't see you out there, hopefully we'll see you on the next video. Thanks, guys.